left off, it would have been at the USJ, more specifically after the whole villain raid on the USJ, and in the aftermath, Izuku would have found out some disturbing news, some very heart-aching sort of news, you could say. This would of course be the death of Minoru Mineta and Suyu Asui. Although he didn't know them all that well, they were still his classmates at the end of the day. This would have affected Izuku's mentality quite a bit. He was unnerved to find out that they were dead. This was the first time he had heard about somebody actually dying, somebody so close, you could say. This hit home for Izuku, and from there on, Izuku would be forced to adapt, you could say. Adapt to this new situation of his. When it came on to the sports festival, it would have been cancelled after everybody found out the news regarding the two deaths at the USJ. UA would have been hounded by the news outlets, media. They would have been slandered. Their name would have been dragged across the mud, but they would still try and keep face. They would have cancelled the sports festival, sure, but that wouldn't mean that the students wouldn't continue their hero training. Instead, what would happen is that the kids at the at least the kids in the hero course, I should say, they would continue to train. This time, even harder than ever. The teachers were not going to be as gentle with their training as they used to be. After the whole death at the USJ, or the deaths at the USJ, the teachers would have realized that their kids had grown too weak, or not necessarily weak, more so that they needed to be trained to an extreme amount. These villains were becoming too crafty. These villains were evolving in their ways of dealing damage to hero society. The fact that they would even go on to attack children was an all-time low. They never thought about this ever before. So now they were going to crack down on their training 100 times, a hundredfold. And Izuku, he would have been all up for it at this point. He would have understood the value of life at that moment. And he did not want to go down like Suyu and Mineta. He wanted to strive forward. He wanted to essentially honor their names in a way. The fact that they ended up giving up their lives in the USJ, or not even really giving up their lives. The fact that they tried to become heroes, and in the end, what ended up happening is that they were too weak. They could not defend themselves against the villains that were there at the USJ. That just showed how much more Izuku had to train to keep his head above the water. And the fact that he had to battle with the Nomu and he was struggling as well showed just how weak Izuku really was. He didn't want to feel weak whatsoever. He disdained ever having to feel weak again, and he would also try and push this ideology onto his classmates as well. He wasn't going to be selfish with this ideology of his from now on. From now on, instead of believing that he was going to be top-notch superior to everybody else, he was going to try and uplift his classmates in a way. But Izuku's way of lifting up his classmates would have been quite brutal, you could say. Day in and day out, Izuku would be found training in the Gamma Gym or any sort of gym within the UA campus. Around this time as well, UA would have adjusted their school to be a dormitory, you could say. Basically, the students would live inside of the UA campus. And Izuku, he had no issues with this. This just meant that it was going to be even easier for him to get his training in. And considering the equipment that UA had, this was going to make training much easier for him. Because back at home, or back at Dagobah Beach, there wasn't that much that he could really train with over time. Sure, he had a bunch of junk, but Yue was just 100 times better, and he would basically drag some of his classmates into the Gamma Gym with him. He would make sure that they got their own piece of training as well, although most of them they would be exhausted from this sort of training that Izuku had in mind for them. Sometimes they would be too sore to even really participate in the training exercises that the teachers would have for them the very next day. And the teachers, as I've established before, they weren't necessarily going easy on the kids either. This would have caused some of the students to feel fatigued. This would have caused some to actually suffer some injuries along the way from this overtraining, you could say. Their bodies were being exhausted. They were being torn down to the bone. They were under the wire when it came on to training, and then they also had to focus on their academic skills as well, which it was a struggle at times because sometimes these kids they just were too tired to even focus in class, and the teachers they weren't going to just let these students slide anymore. They understood everything. They weren't trying to be too rough on them, but at the same time they had to understand that in this new society of theirs, nobody was going to hold their hands in battle. If they were going to go into battle, they needed to make sure that UA was going to provide the Hero Society with the best heroes possible. And considering the deaths of two of the students already, that already meant that they had to buckle down on their training. The students understood this as well, but still, the fact that they were going so hard on training and then Izuku coming in as well, it just made everything even more difficult than it already was. Eventually, the students would be given a break of sorts. This break would be in the form of allowing them to do an internship with some heroes for a week. This was going to be their first time going out ever since, well, the USJ. It had been months, really, and the training had been intense, but now they were finally allowed to go to all of these different heroes to gain another form of understanding for training, learning how to use their quirks, all that. And when it came on to Izuku, he would have looked at the options he was given. Many of the heroes would have been given stats regarding the students. And looking through Izuku's stats, many heroes they actually wanted Izuku as their, well, intern, you could say. They wanted Izuku to be under their guidance for the week. They had no idea what sort of personality Izuku had, but even if they were aware of how, well, I don't even know how to really describe his personality, how diligent you could say Izuku was, how hard-headed at times Izuku could be as well, how strict on training, all of these different aspects of Izuku's personality at this point in life. Some heroes may have been a bit wary of Izuku, but most of them would still probably choose him. And in the end, Izuku would have went down the list, and he would have chosen Gang Orca. He had a mutation quirk, and he was one of the top 10 heroes at the time anyways. He was close to the bottom, but he was still a top 10 hero. Izuku wanted to intern under him for that very reason. He had a mutation quirk. He was strong. He was in the top 10. In all honesty, it seemed that this was going to be the best option for Izuku. He had a great amount of strength, he was aware of that, and his combat skills were superb as well. And although people may have judged him for his looks, he didn't let that bother him whatsoever. Izuku respected that. This was exactly why he selected Gang Orca out of all of the heroes on the list. His respect for Gang Orca was pretty high at this point, and when he came on to training with him as well, he would understand that this man was quite diligent in his training as well. Izuku liked this guy. This training would have been intense, but Izuku liked the intensity of it. He felt as if he needed this intensity, this intense sort of training in order to get anywhere in life. Gang Orca would have realized something off with Izuku, and that was his intense desire to train. He was a workaholic, he would have realized at this point, and he would try to console Izuku about this. He would try and get down to the bottom of why Izuku was like this. It was almost as if Izuku had a form of OCD when it came on to his training, as if he had to be perfect in everything. And Gang Orca, he would find out that Izuku used to be quirkless, and the death of Tsuyu and Mineta also affected him as well. He would try to explain that this wasn't necessarily his fault. Their deaths were because of the villains, and Izuku wasn't there at the time to even protect them. But Izuku, one time, he would actually snap at Gang Orca as well. He would explain that that was the whole point. He wasn't there to protect them. He wasn't there to protect his classmates. How is he ever going to be a hero if he can't protect two people? Two people that needed his help that day, and he couldn't save them. What kind of hero could Izuku call himself? But Gang Orca would also explain that All Might, the number one hero, can only save so many lives as well. He's not everywhere. There are many lives that end up being lost because All Might isn't there. And he has to understand that he's still human. Even All Might has suffered with these issues before. The fact that he can't be there to save everybody, but at the same time he has to understand that he is human. He's not some omnipresent god or whatever. No, he can only be in one place at one time. So it would be best to save as many lives in that area as possible, and don't let the deaths of others affect him too much. Just use that as fuel and motivation to become better, never become complacent. These words would stick with Izuku for a while. These words would have been basically all up in his mind at this point. After the internship was over, Izuku would have found out even more disturbing news. This, of course, being the death of Ida to the likes of Stain, the hero killer. And Izuku, at first, he would have been upset. He would have been angry at himself, the fact that he couldn't be there to save his classmate. But he would remember the words of Gang Orca, not to let that affect him that much. There's always going to be somebody that dies because he's not there, or any other hero. But he can't let those deaths affect him because he is only human, and he can only be in so many places at once. He can only be in one place at one time. And it's not Izuku's fault that one life may have slipped out of his hands. If they're on a whole nother continent, if they're in a whole nother area, it's not Izuku's fault. And Izuku has to understand that. Izuku would just sigh and meditate on these words. He would try and let these words form him moving forward. And of course, when it came on to their practice after their internships with the heroes, Izuku would have shown his new combat skills. He didn't really gain that much in terms of physical abilities. No, he would instead have learned how to calm himself. Actually, he would have learned how to have more of a calm mind in terms of battle, and when it came on to treating himself. And even his classmates would have noticed this difference in Izuku, his destructive nature, you could say, or his OCD. I'm not even quite sure if this is really OCD or not. You guys can correct me in the comments. I don't want to be labeling somebody with a certain, disorder when they actually don't. But basically, Izuku's issues when it came on to training, they would have still been there, but his classmates, they would have noticed that he was a lot calmer in terms of that training as well. Sure, he may have dragged them over to like Gym Gamma many times still, but even then, that training was a whole lot less harsh than before, and they could actually appreciate Izuku for that. They liked this new Izuku, although he was still rough around the edges. This they could handle a lot better, you could say. Eventually, they would have their final exams, in which the students would find out that they would be participating against the teachers. They had to fight in a 2v1, essentially, and the whole goal was to either capture the villain, that being the teachers, or escape. Izuku would have been paired with Bakugo. The two would also have to be going up against All Might. The teachers would have recognized Izuku's incredible strength and combat prowess, and they would have figured that he would have been good to go up against All Might. Same for Bakugo, actually. And they would have also recognized that these two seem to have a bit of a disdain for each other. Going back to even middle school, they would have found out that these two went to the same middle school, and for the longest, Izuku was labeled quirkless. And seeing how Bakugo had even made remarks about Izuku's quirkless nature, the teachers would have figured out that this would have been the perfect matchup to really test these students. And of course, Izuku would do his best to just avoid Bakugo for the most part. He wouldn't be trying to fight All Might. He would have recognized that All Might was too strong for him right now, so he would have tried to escape. And despite that, All Might would have been there to stop him multiple times. Bakugo would have been there to also try and combat against All Might, thinking that he could possibly get the win somehow, but Izuku would have called Bakugo an idiot multiple times for even trying to go up against the number one hero, even if he had a handicap on him. Just because he had a handicap in terms of the strength department didn't necessarily mean that his durability also went down as well. All Might was still incredibly strong with that handicap, and his durability was just as high as ever. He could take a whole lot of punches, and he would just be able to eat them. He would be able to dish out one punch, and Bakugo would have been splattered all over the walls if he went all out. Naturally, All Might wouldn't go all out, but you get the point. Izuku would have used this time to think about plans in order to just escape, until he realized that Bakugo would just be the perfect distraction for All Might. Izuku would have grabbed Bakugo at one point and dragged him over to a corner. He would explain his plan to Bakugo, in which the explosive plan would have just called blasphemy, mentioning how Izuku was a scaredy cat. Of course, Bakugo would be the one that would have to fight All Might. He was the stronger out of the two after all, so it made sense. And Izuku would have just ignored Bakugo's last comment. He already knew that he was stronger than Bakugo. The only thing that Bakugo had over Izuku was range. Izuku had more strength. He had raw strength because of his quirk, and he had incredible speed, but in terms of combat, Bakugo had a medium to long range quirk. He could even use his quirk in close combat as well, technically. Something that Izuku did not have. The closest that Izuku had was, well, his shield. But even then, that was... It was a bit iffy at times. It would be better for Izuku to use the shield to protect himself from injuries. That was pretty much it. Bakugo would go on to fight All Might once again, going all out this time around. He would have even gotten rid of his grenade gauntlets, and he would have tried to fire explosions as big as possible, although they would end up messing with his arms, his wrists. You get the point. But Izuku, during all of this momentum, all of this energy that Bakugo was using up against All Might, he would have used this distraction in order to slip by, and Izuku would of course be able to make it to the finish line. All Might would be surprised. He would have thought that Izuku would have also tried to fight him, but no. It seemed as if Izuku had wised up over these past couple of weeks since internship and recognized that he was at a severe disadvantage when it came on to fighting against All Might, so he would have went on to do the next best thing, and that was to try and escape. Using Bakugo as a distraction was interesting as well. He would have never thought that Izuku would do that, considering the amount of pride he once had, but it seemed as if the USJ and the internship really did humble him. Bakugo would have been a bloody mess, and he would have actually been extremely exhausted as well, but he would just be happy over the fact that he managed to win against All Might, albeit not necessarily in the way he wanted. He wanted to beat All Might in a fist fight, but he understood that he still wasn't going to be strong enough to do such a thing. And if this was the closest he got to being All Might, then, well, so be it. The next issue would arrive when it came on to the mountain training arc. You see, Aizawa would have told the kids that when it came on to this whole Asana thing, the hot spa, yeah, it turns out that was a lie. Those who failed the final exams were still going up to the mountain lodge for this summer, but there was another catch. This wasn't going to just be a hot spa or, well, just some play area. No, none of that. They should have known better anyways. What's really happening is that this whole situation is regarding, well, training. The kids were going to be training up in the mountains for the summer to get them right for when it came on to next year, when it came on to getting their provisional hero licenses. Although some of the students would groan, Izuku would have just stayed silent, listening, and he would just not respond whatsoever. He would have just accepted his fate. He had no issues with training after all. He was a workaholic at times, but he had become better, you could say. And on the bus ride to the mountains, Aizawa would strangely stop the bus in the middle of the forest. Many of the students would actually get off the bus, well, actually all of them, wondering just what was going on, until a woman in blue introduced herself as Pixie Bob and slammed her foot, not her foot, but her hand on the ground floor. All of a sudden, the ground began to shift and morph into these weird dirt monsters. Izuku's classmates would have immediately recognized what was going to be happening, and they weren't in the mood for this whatsoever. They would try and flee the scene. They would try to get back on the bus, but Aizawa would have been long gone. Izuku wouldn't even bother trying to catch up with the bus either. Sure, he could probably run after it, but if Aizawa noticed him, he would probably just step on the gas a bit more. And although Izuku was fast, he was only so fast. He couldn't really keep up with a moving cart that was going, say, 150 miles per hour or something. Like a moderate speed, more like 45 miles, all that's what he could probably keep up with that. But there was only so much, you get the point. Izuku and his classmates, they would go on to be forced to fight off these dirt monsters, and a lot of them would have been a breeze for Izuku. He would have just slammed his shield into most of them, or thrown his shield at a lot of these dirt monsters, and he would have grabbed his shield afterwards. He would have also punched through a lot of these great monsters, and so would many of the other classmates as well. Eventually, they would have been tired out from all of this fighting. Although Izuku would have still been standing strong, he was, well, a super soldier to an extent. Well, not even to an extent. In a sense, he was a super soldier. And he was basically conditioned to handle these sort of things better than most people, most quite individuals. When they finally made it up to the mountain lodge, Izuku would have still been standing strong, which would impress the hero team. You know the name. I'm not saying it. But a lot of his classmates, they would have just collapsed to the floor at this point. They were exhausted beyond comprehension. They were only really still breathing and conscious because of the over excessive training that they had been doing previously at school or in their dormitories. The heroes would just look at the students and just they would honestly just tick at the students, mentioning how their training was going to be a whole lot harder from here. The students, most of them, they would just immediately fall unconscious hearing that. And the next day, Izuku would have woken up to a loud sound. He would have immediately gotten up alongside the rest of his classmates. They would have been all pretty confused, wondering just what was happening, until Aizawa arrived in their rooms, explaining that they were going to be training their quirks today. They would have been even more confused now, until Aizawa went and grabbed a ball. He would have chucked it over to Izuku, and he would make a request for Izuku to throw it. Throw it outside. Throw it as far as possible. Izuku would do so, and Aizawa would clock in a score that was moderately higher than his, well, beginning score, the one at the beginning of the school year, but it was a whole lot less than what most people were expecting. They were expecting for Izuku to have hit, say, 100, 200, shoot, even maybe 300 more meters than before, but no. Izuku only managed to do it like about 30 to 40 more meters. That was about it. Which Aizawa did mention that was rather impressive. But he also mentioned that Izuku did have like a physical strength enhancing quirk, so in training, in any sense of the word, it would probably increase his strength as well. It could, his physical training, it was just going to help strengthen his quirk overall. Izuku was kind of a bad choice, and he would have thrown the ball over to Katsuki Bakugo next. And Bakugo, he would have had even less improvement as well. And Aizawa would mention that, see, notice the difference here? You guys seem to be under the impression that your quirks got stronger over all this training period. But as a matter of fact, we've just been doing a whole lot of physical training. We haven't really been training your quirks. Sure, you may have gotten a couple new skills while using your quirks during all of this training, but when it comes on to the overall strength of your quirks, they're still lacking. What good will your quirks be in real life, in a real life battle against villains, if your quirk strength is still only comparable to that of, say, a middle schooler? Which a lot of the class would take offense to, but Aizawa would immediately hush them up, mentioning how that they needed to increase the strength of their quirks during this time at the mountain training. or the mountain lodge, whatever you want to call it. And that's precisely what all of them would end up doing. When it came out to Izuku's training in particular, he would have been lifting all kinds of things. He would have gone on to lift some boulders, and he would have went on to lift teachers, students, just lift as many heavy things as possible, and then to move around with them as well. Run, as a matter of fact, sometimes. And despite how heavy some of them were, Izuku would put in his best effort in order to run as fast as possible and for as long as possible as well to build up his endurance. His physical endurance would be something necessary alongside his speed for the future. He needed to be able to keep up with his villains and keep up for a very long time. He couldn't afford to get winded very soon, very fast. If he were to move at his top speed, he couldn't just be too winded immediately after, I don't know, 5 seconds. And even if Izuku had the conditioning of a super soldier, that was really only going to get him so far. Your physical endurance, that's something that still needs to be built up over time. And that's precisely what Azawa would be having for pretty much all of the class, really. Same for Class 1B as well, when it came on to their training with their teacher as well. Nobody was going to be given any freebies in this situation. And this would be what the whole classes would be doing for the time on the Mountain Lodge. No villains would actually attack in this timeline, considering the fact that the main reason they came to attack the Mountain Lodge was because they wanted Bakugo. They had observed Bakugo for a while, and how he acted in the USJ. It was befitting of a villain more than a hero, and they wanted to capture him to also demotivate the heroes as well. But after everything that had happened recently, they didn't seem to really have any need for that. They had already demoralized the heroes one time when it came on to the deaths of Suya and Mineta, and then another time with the death of, well, one of the Idas, literally literally a hero child, you could say. Or basically this. Tenya Ida came from the Ingenium family, a family a family full of heroes, and yet he died. The media, I didn't even mention this before, but they were all over UA for this death as well. They chewed out UA harshly. They criticized the methods of their teaching. Just how exactly were they really teaching their students if they were just going to be dying left and right? Some parents were really considering taking their kids out to the hero course as well. Some of them actually would, at least for Class 1B. They didn't want to risk that. They didn't want to risk any sort of bad luck being passed on to them, although they may have still had their 20 classmates in number in terms of pristine or whatever, but they were afraid that they would get 1A's cursed soon, very soon. They didn't want to risk losing their children at such a young age. And that's why some of them would be removed from the class. When it came on to 1A, it would take a lot of convincing, but most of them would actually still stay in the class. It was just the weaker ones like Ojiro and, Ojiro and Invisible Girl, you can say. They were the main ones that were being taken out of the class. After the training at the Mountain Lodge, the US students would go back to the campus and they would go on to learn how to create super moves, basically to market themselves. And this would be also in preparation for the provisional hero license exam. Izuku wouldn't really know what to do besides maybe mimic All Might's punches, but All Might would give him some more tips. mentioning how he didn't have to fight in the exact same way as him. And Izuku would think back to how he trained with Gang Orca as well, and he would try and mimic some of Gang Orca's style. He would try and mimic the style of multiple heroes actually, until he managed to create his own form of style, something that was a mix of many heroes and martial arts, but also in a way that adjusted to his own build. Something that adjusted to the way that he used his quirk, and the fact that he also had his shield with him most of the time as well. These would have been his super moves. I'm not listing them out. Nah, forget that. You all can be creative enough. It honestly didn't take long for the hero license exam to arrive. It honestly felt like it had only been a day since they had been training their quirks. And no, not even just a day that they've been training their quirks. It only felt like yesterday that these kids just finally made it into the UA, and now they were going to get their hero license exams. Izuku and his classmates, they would have been worried. They would have been a bit nervous, but they wouldn't let this nervousness distract them. They would do their very best, and throughout all of it, Izuku would surely end up getting his hero license exam. Well, oh my goodness. Izuku would, by the very end up making it to the end of the hero licensing exam, and he would have been one of the people to gain his license, his provisional hero license. And he would also go on to end up having an internship with Night Eye apparently. This guy seemed to be rather interested in him. And when it came on to the motivational part as well, Izuku would have met up with the big three. Not only Izuku, but many of his classmates as well. They would have ended up meeting the big three of UA. This being, of course, Mirio Tagata, Tamaki Amajiki, and Nejire. And Nejire, I forgot her last name. Was it like Hado? No, like Nejire Hado or something? But Mirio, he would have noticed the unenthusiastic faces on many of the students' faces when it came on to internships, and hearing the whole issue of what happened before, of course, this being the death of Ida when it came on to the last internship that they had, he would have understood why they weren't really all that interested in interning once again. But this time with licenses, meaning that they had less restriction on what they could do. So Mirio would try and show them the light side. They would go on to have a bit of a spar, and this spar would have literally just been Mirio wrecking everybody. Izuku would have been the best shot against Mirio, but even then, at the very end, Mirio would have still been able to get a number on Izuku. Izuku would have been rather sturdy of an individual, and Mirio would have complimented Izuku for that, recognizing that just punching him wasn't going to be enough, and he would go on to power up in a sense. Izuku could notice immediately something was off about Mirio when he just stopped, permeating through the floor and going back up, like using his permeation quirk or whatever. This was different. It was as if he had two quirks, and Mirio would have sucker punched Izuku, and this punch would have sent Izuku flying. Izuku would have ended up landing on his back, and he would have gasped for air. He would have been rubbing his jaw as well. He wasn't expecting for Mirio to be so strong. And many of the students in Class 1A would have recognized this as well. It was no mere feat to just be able to knock Izuku back like that. It took some of the strongest individuals within Class 1A to even leave a scratch on Izuku with how durable he was. But yet, Mirio managed to just land one blow on Izuku and send him flying? just how strong was this guy? That's how a lot of these guys were literally thinking at this point. Many of them wanted to know how strong Mirio was. They would have been crowding around him, wondering just wondering what sort of quirk he had. And Mirio would have explained that his quirk was permeation, which it sounded cool at first until he explained the whole issue of him basically becoming deaf and blind to the world. He had to develop a sort of echolocation when it came onto his quirk in order to just be able to use it properly. He was not born with a strong quirk. He made it strong. And when it came onto what Mirio did with Izuku, he explained that he learned another neat trick about his quirk recently, and that was that he could build up a certain amount of kinetic energy while bouncing around, and he would have used this kinetic energy in order to send Izuku flying. Well, in actuality, that was not the case whatsoever. That was just some lie he made up on the spot. Many of them wouldn't have known that, well, Mirio was actually the ninth holder of One for All at this point in time. Seeing just how strong Mirio was, this would have also interested Izuku, and he would also find out a bit more about Mirio. This, of course, being his whole ordeal with Sir Night Eye, and that's how we end up in this current situation, where Zuko finds himself, well, interning under Sir Night Eye. This next internship would be rather strange for Zuko. It seemed as if Sir Night Eye was a very meticulous sort of person. He was strict, he also seemed to like jokes as well. This guy seemed rather confusing to Izuku. This guy seemed so serious, but at the same time he had a tickle machine. Was this guy into what he thought he was? No, that can't be. There's somebody so pristine or like prestigious as Sir Night Eye, there was no way that guy had that sort of kink, right? Ah, well, it wasn't his business. He supposed that every hero had their kinks, but that wasn't something that Izuku was going to get himself involved in. Instead, he was just going to learn more about how to be a hero, and he would have gone to patrol with Mirio. They would have ended up encountering a little girl, though, on the way. This little girl had some issues, though. She had bandages all around her arms, and there was this seemingly call for help with the way that she just jumped into Izuku's arms and just grabbed onto him, mentioning how she didn't want to be let go of. This way that she hugged him, it was in fear as well. Until this one guy managed to walk out to the corner. He would have explained that he was this little girl's father and that she was a bit of a klutz. And that was the whole reason why she was bandaged up. The whole reason that she ran away in the first place was because she got in trouble and she didn't want to take the punishment. They probably understood that this was just what a father had to deal with when it came on to their child. But Izuku could immediately smell cap. Izuku knew what a good father was like, and he already could tell that this wasn't a good father. This guy didn't even look like Eri whatsoever. He showed no resemblance to this little girl whatsoever. He also looked rather young, which was kinda suspicious in Izuku's opinion. A lot of things were pointing to the fact that, well, this guy wasn't who he claimed he was. And Izuku had mentioned that, okay, since he was their father, then they should have no issue taking a blood test or anything. Eri would try to wiggle out of Izuku's arms, recognizing just what, well, Chisaki was about to do. and she didn't want Izuku and Mirio to get hurt for the sake of herself. But Izuku would have just grabbed tighter onto Eri. He wasn't going to let this little girl slip out of his hands. No. He had already lost too many lives already. He wasn't going to let another life be lost. And just because of something out of his control. He recognized that this little girl needed saving, and this was the one time he actually had things under his control. The first time that he actually felt like he could actually do something in order to save somebody. There's no way that he was going to call himself a hero and let this little girl just be dragged back to some sort of hellhole, because the way that he was acting and the way this guy talked, it was unnatural to Izuku. So Izuku, he would try and flee the scene with Eri, although when it came on to Mirio, he would try and stop Izuku, mentioning how they needed to return the little girl to her father. But immediately after Mirio said that, large spikes would immediately begin to form around the vicinity. Izuku would have immediately been too agile as well. Izuku would have, well, let me repeat that. Let me rephrase that. Izuku would have immediately recognized these fast approaching, well, spikes, and he would have jumped into the air. He would be rather fast. He would have also been rather, well, let me just say this. Izuku could jump good. Izuku could jump really good. He was able to grab onto a brick building and climb up with Eri in one arm. Sure, he also had his shield in his arms as well, but it was okay. He was able to handle the weight. And they were able to just run for the most part. They were just running around the whole place. Eventually, Mirio would just have to put an end to Chisaki, though. He would knock out Chisaki, and they would basically have this guy locked up for a while. So night, finding out what ended up happening, would actually be rather furious with Izuku for his recklessness in the situation. But he would sigh and also mention that he supposed that this recklessness was kind of good in this situation, considering the fact that Izuku and Mirio managed to capture a high-level Yakuza member. This was actually the current leader of the Yakuza, and Kachisaki, also known as Overhaul. And they've been trying to get some date on this guy for the longest. And they've been looking at this little girl, Eri, and her medical records were rather strange. On top of that, they also noticed some DNA of Chisaki on her. She seemed to be harmed in many places along her arms. The way that they unwrapped the bandages and noticed the amount of scars on the little girl's body at such a young age was kind of terrifying to many of the doctors, and they would go through a close examination, realizing that Chisaki's quirk had some sort of, well, effect on her. Many signs were showing that Chisaki seemed to have had an effect on Eri. They would go on to also have a bit of an interrogation with Eri as well. They would question just exactly what Chisaki did to her over the years, and they would have also made sure that, well, the best detective at the time, the one that was friends with All Might, Sukaichi, I believe his name was, he would be the one to actually interrogate Eri for the fact that he had a quirk that was able to detect lies, and throughout all of the statements that Eri gave, he was only able to detect a couple of lies that are being made just to protect Chisaki out of fear of what would happen. But in the end, they were able to relieve Eri, and she would come clean, mentioning just how horrific of an experience that she ended up having over the years. And this information would have been enough to lock up Chisaki, and they would have also gone on to do the same for the rest of the Yakuza members. They would have had an all-out raid that well, the very next week they would have recruited as many heroes as possible in order to have a raid against the Yakuzas. And they would have also found out during this time that the League of Villains was also being allied with, well, the Yakuza. They would have managed to take down quite a number of Yakuza. Some may have managed to escape, but for the most part they were able to take down a whole organization, a whole underground organization. And when it came onto the League of Villains, sure, they may have managed to get away for the most part, but they wouldn't manage to get away for very long because, well, from there on, over the years, Izuku would have continued to grow in strength and power. He would have made sure to avenge his classmates one way or another, and by the end, Izuku would have been powerful enough to rival All Might in terms of strength. All Might would have continued to diminish in terms of power, but he would have also found out about the existence of All For One. All For One would have still been alive at this time, and he was still trying to recuperate. He was hoping to eventually get his hands on Eri so that she could rewind his body back to its prime, but it seemed as if that wasn't going to happen anymore. And All Might would have also managed to find All For One's location. The two would have duked it out, and although All Might was rather weak at this point, he was still far stronger than All For One overall. Just when All For One thought he was going to be getting the advantage when he hit All Might in his weak spot, he would have ended up getting bombarded by punches from Mirio Tagata and, well, Izuku Midoriya, also known as Soldier Boy. Mirio Tagata would have also been referred to as Lemillion at this point. Both of them would have had their hero licenses, and they would have been full-fledged heroes at this point. These two would have duked it out against All For One, and the fact that these guys were both practically as strong as All Might, if not stronger at this point, this would have been enough to pretty much take down All For One, and his whole organization would have began to crumble from there. Sure, some of them may have tried to escape, but they would have had GPSs managed, not necessarily GPS, but tracking devices would have been placed onto some of these villains thanks to the efforts of Creati, also known as Momo Yaoyorozu. And overall, pretty much all of the villains, they would have been defeated. Izuku would have had a confidence boost over this time. He would have become far stronger, and he would have also used this time to, well, take down these many villains. He would have gone for many days taking down villains without rest. And although Mirio mentioned that this was kind of unhealthy, Izuku mentioned that he just needed to get this sort of relief. He needed to protect many people, and he was going to rest soon. He just wanted to take down as many League members as possible. And Mirio would let Izuku just go on. He would just let Izuku go off from there. Izuku would have taken down pretty much the whole League of Villains. Not necessarily by himself, but a good amount of them would have been taken down by Izuku alone. Others would have been taken down by his classmates or other heroes. But in the end, what really mattered was that the League of Villains would have been no more. And unfortunately, Mirio Tagata, the number one hero at this point in time, would have died a few years later from some sort of terminal illness. They didn't necessarily know what was the whole cause behind it. All they knew was that Mirio died for some reason, and Izuku would have ended up becoming the next number one hero. One for All would have died with Mirio, and Izuku would not have been aware whatsoever of the Quirk. All he knew was that Mirio was a great hero, and that he was somebody to look up to. and Izuku would continue to look up to Muriel, All Might, Gang Orca, all of these heroes that helped to form Izuku into the person that he was to this day. And he had also managed to become less violent. He had learned to overcome his former issues. He had learned to become a better person to his teammates. Although sometimes he would be a bit too pushy with his teammates, he had become better. And this is how we basically end the story. So yeah, that's basically what if Deku was Soldier Boy. And if you guys think that there should have been something different to have happened, let me know in the comments. Let me know your interpretations of how the story should have gone, all that sort of information. Just leave it down in the comments. And if you like the story, just give it a like and maybe even share it. If you've been rocking with my content for a while as well, shoot, maybe, I don't know, subscribe. And click the notification bell so you don't miss any of my videos. But yeah, that's basically all I have to really say. It's your boy Kintai Next saying out. Peace!